Hello, everyone. Welcome back to today's story. In this episode, we continue the story just before James and Diep's wedding day, a moment that should be filled with joy, but is instead packed with pressure, exhaustion. With the big day approaching, every small detail suddenly feels heavy, and the fear of something going wrong starts to creep in. That's when Phat steps in. Not just as a helper, but as the quiet backbone holding everything together. From organizing people, fixing last-minute problems, to protecting James and Diep from emotional burnout. Stay until the end to see how preparation turns into trust, and how this wedding becomes more than just a ceremony. And don't forget to subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us. The morning sun hadn't fully burned through the mist when Phat rode his motorbike into James and Diep's yard. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires made Diep look up from the stack of folded fabric she was sorting on the wooden table. She smiled as soon as she recognized him. "Phat, you're early," she called out, brushing dust off her hands. Phat parked the bike carefully near the mango tree, taking in the scene around him. The yard looked nothing like it had a few weeks ago. Bamboo poles were stacked neatly against the fence. Strings of small lights hung loosely between branches, and bundles of red ribbons sat in baskets, waiting to be tied. It felt busy, hopeful, and slightly chaotic. The unmistakable energy of a wedding slowly coming together. "I figured if I came late, there'd be nothing left for me to help with," Phat joked as he walked over. "James texted me like 5 times last night. I could tell you two were already stressed." Diep laughed, but it carried a hint of exhaustion. "That obvious, huh? We keep thinking we're done, then suddenly realize there's another list." James stepped out from the house at that moment, carrying a notebook and a tape measure. "You have no idea how good it is to see you," he said, half serious. "I was about to start measuring the yard for the seating area again, just to make sure." Phat took the notebook from James's hand and flipped it open. The pages were filled with crossed-out notes, arrows and scribbles, flowers, tables, guest names, food arrangements. He nodded slowly, already shifting into problem-solving mode. "Okay," he said. "First rule, stop remeasuring the same thing. Second rule, we divide tasks, or you two are going to collapse before the wedding even starts." Diep exhaled in relief. "See, this is why we needed you." They sat together under the mango tree, using overturned crates as seats. Phat listened carefully as James and Diep explained their plan. They wanted a simple wedding, nothing flashy, but still warm and meaningful. Family, close friends, homemade food, and decorations they could do themselves. The challenge wasn't money as much as time and coordination. Phat tapped the notebook with his finger. "All right, let's break this down. Seating, stage area, decorations, food prep, and timing. Today, we focus on the yard and decorations. Food can wait until tomorrow." James nodded. "I was thinking the same, but every time I start, I get distracted." "That's because you're trying to do everything at once," Phat replied. "Trust me, I've helped with enough weddings to know how this goes." They started with the yard. Phat walked around, counting steps, pointing to different spots. "We'll place the guest tables here in 2 rows. Leave space in the middle so people can walk easily. The small stage goes near the house, facing out. Diep followed closely, visualizing each suggestion. What about the lights? Phat looked up at the branches overhead. String them from that tree to the fence, then across to the house. At night, it'll look warm, not too bright, romantic, but simple. James smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. That actually sounds perfect. They spent the next hour tying ropes, adjusting poles, and moving old benches out of storage. Phat worked quickly but carefully, showing James how to secure the bamboo so it wouldn't wobble. Every now and then, he'd crack a joke to keep the mood light. Careful, he teased, when James struggled with a knot. If this falls during the wedding, people will remember that more than the vows. James laughed. No pressure, right? Diep watched them, occasionally stepping in to help, occasionally just standing back with a quiet smile. Seeing James laugh like that, without worry clouding his face, made her chest feel lighter. Around late morning, Diep brought out a tray of tea and homemade snacks. They sat on the steps, sweat damp and dusty, sipping slowly. I didn't realize preparing for a wedding could feel like building a house, Diep said. Phat nodded. In a way, it is. You're building the space where your new life starts. The words lingered for a moment. James glanced at Diep, and she looked back at him, eyes soft. Neither of them said anything, but the meaning was clear. After the break, Phat turned his attention to the decorations. He opened one of the baskets, pulling out ribbons and small artificial flowers. Who tied these? I did, Diep said cautiously. Phat smiled. They're nice, but if we add a second ribbon here and keep the colors consistent, it'll look more polished. He showed her a quick technique. Simple loops, tight knots, clean lines. Diep practiced beside him, hands moving faster with each try. You should have been a wedding planner, she said. Phat shook his head. Too much pressure. I just like helping friends. By noon, the yard already looked different. The layout was clear, decorations were starting to take shape, and the chaos felt manageable. James wiped his forehead and looked around, genuinely surprised. I didn't think we'd get this far today. That's because you had backup, Phat said. And we're not done yet. He glanced at the house. Next, we sort the guest list and seating plan. That's where arguments usually start. Diep groaned. Please don't remind me. Phat laughed. Relax, I'll keep the peace. They moved inside, spreading papers across the table. Names were read aloud. Some debated. Others immediately agreed on. Phat played mediator when James and Diep disagreed, gently steering them back to what mattered. This is your wedding, he reminded them. Not everyone will be perfectly happy, and that's okay. As the afternoon light slanted through the windows, the atmosphere shifted from stress to excitement. Every decision, every small step forward made the wedding feel more real. Phat leaned back in his chair, stretching. All right, that's enough for today. If we push too hard, you'll hate your own wedding before it even happens. James chuckled. I think you just saved us. Diep smiled warmly. Thank you, Phat. Seriously, we couldn't have done this without you. Phat waved it off, standing up. That's what friends are for. Tomorrow, we tackle the next round. He looked around the room one more time, satisfied with the progress. Outside, the breeze stirred the ribbons gently, as if already rehearsing for the big day. The morning before the wedding didn't feel like a normal morning at all. It felt like the last stretch of a long climb, where you're close enough to see the peak, but every step still matters. When Phat arrived, the sky was still pale, and the air had that cool, clean smell that only exists before the village wakes up. He parked his motorbike quietly at the gate and just stood there for a second, scanning the yard. The bamboo frames were stable, the light strings were still intact, and the tables were stacked under a tarp. From a distance, everything looked ready. But Phat knew better. Weddings don't fall apart because of big problems. They fall apart because of small details people forget until it's too late. James stepped out of the house wearing an old t-shirt, hair slightly messy, holding a pen and a folded paper. His expression gave him away. He was trying to look calm, but his mind was running in 10 different directions. "You're early again," James said, half laughing, half relieved. "Today needs early," Phat replied. "Where's Diep?" "In the kitchen. She's been up since... I don't even know." Phat nodded and walked in without making a big entrance. Inside, Diep stood near the counter with her sleeves rolled up, carefully sorting small bundles of herbs and leaves. Her movements were precise, like she was trying to control everything with her hands because her thoughts were too loud. When she saw Phat, her face softened instantly. "Thank God, you're here." Phat didn't tease her. He simply asked, "What's the most urgent thing on your mind right now?" Diep swallowed. "The timeline, the food coordination, the guest seating, and the unexpected stuff. Like, what if the chairs arrive late? What if the sound system fails? What if it rains?" Phat raised his eyebrows. "Okay, we'll handle all of that, but we're going to do it in order, one thing at a time." James pulled a chair out, and the three of them sat at the table like a small command center. Phat unfolded a fresh sheet of paper and drew quick sections: food, guests, ceremony, backup plans, roles. "First," he said, tapping the page, "roles. You two keep trying to do everything yourselves. That ends today." Diep opened her mouth to protest, but Phat lifted a finger. "No, this is not a discussion. You're the bride and groom, not the staff." He stepped outside and gathered a small group of helpers: 2 aunties, an uncle, a couple of cousins, and 1 neighbor, who always volunteered for anything community-related. Phat didn't talk to them like they were being hired. He talked to them like they mattered, like their help had meaning. "Auntie, you'll be the welcome face at the gate. You greet guests, guide them in, and you don't let anyone wander into the kitchen. Cousin, you're in charge of seating. If someone shows up unconfirmed, you don't panic. You adjust calmly. Uncle, you oversee parking. You keep the front clear, so no one blocks the entrance. And you," he said to the neighbor, "you're my runner. If something needs fetching, you do it fast." Everyone nodded, strangely energized by the clarity. Back inside, James looked at Phat in awe. "How did you make that look so easy?" Phat shrugged. "People want to help. They just don't want to guess what to do." With roles assigned, the second major task was the kitchen plan. The yard could look beautiful, but if food came out late or chaotic, guests would feel uncomfortable. Phat stepped into the kitchen space and immediately started reorganizing the workflow. "Okay," he said, pointing. Vegetables get washed here. Cutting happens here. Cooked items stay here, covered. Nothing crosses paths, or you'll have mess and confusion. Diep watched him move containers and label lids with a marker. I already sorted those, she said quietly. I know, Phat replied. You sorted them as ingredients. Now we sort them as steps. Tomorrow, people won't think. They'll follow. James leaned against the doorway, listening, and he realized something he hadn't allowed himself to realize before. Diep had been carrying this wedding like it was a test she had to pass alone. And he'd been doing the same in a different way, carrying responsibility like a punishment. Phat clapped his hands lightly. Now, list the dishes, not the dream dishes, the real dishes. They chose practical options, food that could be cooked in batches, served warm, and didn't require complicated last-minute attention. Phat made sure there was enough, but he also made sure it wasn't excessive. Better to finish strong than to overwhelm yourselves, he reminded them. By late morning, the first unexpected problem hit: the sound system. James had borrowed it from someone he trusted, and it had worked during testing days ago. But now, when they tried it again, it crackled with static. A microphone cut out mid-sentence. The speakers buzzed in an irritating way that would ruin any emotional moment. James frowned deeply. It was fine last time. Phat didn't even let James spiral. He immediately unplugged it and tried a second cable. Still static. Nope, Phat said decisively. Unreliable. James looked worried. Renting another system will cost. Phat held up his hand. I'm not asking you to rent. I'll find a backup. He stepped outside, made 2 phone calls, and returned with a calm expression that told them the issue was already dead. A friend has a small system. Not fancy, but stable. I'll pick it up tonight. Diep stared at him. You're doing too much. Phat shook his head. I'm doing what matters. At midday, the heat rose sharply, and exhaustion began to show in everyone's faces. Helpers continued chopping and sorting, but Diep started moving slower, her eyes distant. She tried to keep smiling, but the smile didn't fully reach her eyes. Phat noticed. He always noticed. He walked over quietly and asked, What are you feeling right now? Honestly? Diep hesitated, then her voice cracked slightly. I'm afraid of disappointing people. I'm afraid of messing up. I know it's supposed to be happy, but I keep thinking about what could go wrong. Phat crouched slightly, meeting her gaze. Diep, listen. People don't come to your wedding to judge you. They come to witness your love. If something is imperfect, it becomes part of the memory, not a failure. James stepped closer and gently held her hand. I don't care if the ribbon falls off a chair. I just want you to be okay. Diep blinked hard, nodding, and for a second, she allowed herself to breathe fully. After lunch, Phat pushed them into a rehearsal, not the dramatic kind, but the practical kind. He wanted them to walk the flow of the wedding day, so it felt familiar, not frightening. Okay, he said, standing at the gate. Imagine guests arriving. Auntie stands here. She welcomes. She guides. Then they move to tables. Seton cousin watches for confusion. He walked them through the aisle area. Here's where you stand before walking in, he told Diep. You take one breath, one real breath. You don't rush. He turned to James. And you? You don't look at the ground. You look up. You look at her. James gave a small smile. I can do that. They practiced the slow walk, the pause, where James would stand, where Diep would join him, how the ceremony would begin. The more they repeated it, the more natural it felt. Diep's shoulders slowly relaxed. James's face softened. Phat waved it off, but his voice was warm. Tomorrow, I'll arrive early. I'll handle the sound system. I'll guide people. I'll fix whatever tries to break the flow. He started toward the gate, then paused and looked back at them. The yard behind them glowed like a small universe of effort and care.